Sometimes a journey of faith begins not in a moment of enlightenment, but in a place of indifference. We often imagine our greatest spiritual figures as being born with a deep connection to the divine, but the story of St. Patrick starts in a much more human place. He was born in Roman Britain in the late 4th century, a time when the old empire was beginning to fray at its edges. His name was not Patrick then, but Maewyn Sucat. His father, Calpurnius, was a deacon in the Christian church, and his grandfather had been a priest before him. And you would think that growing up in such a family would fill a young boy with piety and devotion, but that was not the case for Maewyn. As a teenager, he was like many young people today. The rituals and doctrines of his family's faith held little interest for him. He saw the church as his father's world, not his own. The stories of God and the scriptures were just words, background noise to a life filled with the concerns of youth. He lived in a comfortable home, a Roman villa, enjoying the privileges that came with his family's status. The grand questions of the universe, why are we here, what is our purpose, did not occupy his mind. His world was one of relative peace and predictability, a life he assumed would continue on its steady course, untouched by the great dramas of faith or suffering that lay just over the horizon. He admitted as much himself later in life in the words he left behind for us. He wrote that he and his people had strayed from God. They did not keep his commandments and did not listen to the priests who warned them of their spiritual neglect. For a boy of 16, the world was a tangible place of fields, friends, and the simple rhythms of daily life. The unseen realm of the spirit felt distant and irrelevant. He was unaware that his comfortable existence was fragile and that the world he knew was about to be shattered. He was living in the calm before a storm that would steal his freedom, but in a twist of fate, give him his true purpose. This young man, living on the edge of a fading Roman world, was about to be thrust into an entirely different reality. He was not a saint. He was not a believer. He was just a boy, blissfully ignorant of the destiny that awaited him. His story is a powerful reminder that the path to profound faith is not always a straight line. Sometimes it begins with being completely and utterly lost. And for Maewyn, being lost was not just a spiritual state. It was about to become a harsh physical reality that would redefine his entire existence and set in motion a legacy that would echo for centuries. The world can change in an instant. One moment you are secure in everything you know. The next you are adrift in a sea of terror. For the 16-year-old Maewyn, that moment came with the brutal efficiency of a pirate raid. Irish marauders scouring the coasts of Britain for plunder and people descended upon his family's home. In the chaos and violence, the life he had known was torn away from him. He was captured along with thousands of others and forced onto a ship bound for a strange and hostile land. The familiar shores of Roman Britain receded into the distance, replaced by the cold, unforgiving waters of the Irish Sea. He was no longer a citizen of Rome. He was now property. He was taken to Ireland, a land that existed on the very edge of the known world, a place untouched by Roman legions or Christian missionaries. It was a pagan land, governed by the ancient rhythms of tribal life and the mysterious power of the Druids. Maewyn was sold into slavery. His new life was one of relentless hardship. He was sent to the windswept hills, likely in the west of Ireland, to work as a shepherd. He He, a boy from a comfortable home, was now forced to tend flocks in all weather, enduring the biting wind, the freezing rain, and the gnawing loneliness of a captive in a foreign land. His captors saw him not as a person, but as a tool. The days bled into one another, each one a mirror of the last. His work was physically demanding, but the emotional and spiritual toll was even greater. He was isolated, surrounded by a people whose language he did not understand and whose ways were completely alien to him. The comfort of his family, the laughter of his friends, the very sense of who he was, it all seemed like a distant dream. He was stripped of his name, his freedom, and his hope. The boy who had once ignored the teachings of his faith was now confronted with the raw, brutal realities of human suffering. There was no one to turn to, no one to cry out to. In this deep abyss of despair, something began to stir within him. The seeds of faith planted in his childhood, but left untended, began to sprout in the harsh soil of his enslavement. And when you have nothing left, you often find what truly matters. In his profound isolation, with only the sheep and the sky for company, Maewyn began to look inward and upward. The God he had so casually dismissed in his youth was becoming his only companion. The emptiness of his surroundings forced him to confront the emptiness in his own heart. And in that barren landscape, a new and powerful spiritual journey was about to begin. Suffering has a way of stripping away all that is unnecessary. It forces us to confront the core of our being. For the young slave shepherd alone on the desolate Irish hills, the years of hardship became a crucible for his soul. The faith he had once ignored now became his only refuge. In the profound silence of his solitude, broken only by the bleating of sheep and the howl of the wind, he began to pray. It was not the formal, rehearsed prayer of a church service. It was the desperate, heartfelt cry of a soul in pain, a conversation with the only being who seemed to be listening. He was no longer Maewyn, the indifferent son of a deacon. He was becoming Patrick, a man of God. In his own writings, The Confession, he describes this transformation with powerful simplicity. He wrote that his love and fear of God grew more and more, and his faith was strengthened. He would rise before dawn in the frost and the snow to pray. He would pray in the woods and on the mountainside. He tells us he would say as many as 100 prayers during the day and nearly as many at night. This was not a duty, it was a compulsion, a spiritual hunger that had been awakened by his suffering. The spirit within him, he said, was fervent. The empty rituals of his childhood had been replaced by a living, breathing relationship with the divine. This constant prayer did more than just provide comfort. It reshaped his perception of the world. The harsh landscape that was his prison began to feel like a sanctuary. The loneliness that had once crushed him became a sacred solitude where he could feel the presence of God more acutely than ever before. He was no longer just a slave tending sheep. He was a shepherd in a deeper sense, learning to listen for the voice of his own shepherd. This period of his life, which could have broken him, instead forged an unbreakable spiritual resilience. And he was discovering a freedom that no chains could bind, a freedom of the spirit. After 6 long years of this life of servitude and prayer, of hardship and Holy Communion, the boy had become a man. His body was weathered by the elements, but his spirit was forged in fire. He had been taken from his home as a worldly teenager and had been transformed into a mystic. He did not know what the future held, or if he would ever see his family again, but he knew with a certainty that burned within him that he was not alone. God was with him, and this profound conviction was about to guide him on the next, most improbable chapter of his journey, the path to freedom. 2. Faith is not just about believing in something. It is about trusting that belief enough to act. After 6 years of fervent prayer and spiritual awakening in the lonely hills of Ireland, Patrick's devotion was about to be answered in a way he could never have predicted. The answer did not come from a burning bush or a booming voice from the heavens. It came to him in the quiet of the night, in a dream. It was a vision, a message from the divine realm he had grown so close to. A voice spoke to him, clear and direct, telling him, "It is well that you fast, for your ship is ready." This was the moment his faith was put to the test. The message was cryptic, yet filled with promise. It spoke of a ship, a symbol of escape and return, but the ship was 200 miles away, a daunting journey for a runaway slave through a land he did not know, filled with people who would see him as nothing more than lost property. To undertake such a journey was an act of immense courage and even greater faith. He had to believe that the voice was real, that the promise was true. Leaving the relative security of his known servitude for the complete uncertainty of the open road was a leap into the unknown, but the voice had ignited a hope that was stronger than his fear. He decided to run. His journey to the coast was an ordeal in itself. For days, he traveled on foot, avoiding roads and settlements, likely surviving on what little he could find. Every shadow could have been a pursuer, every stranger a threat, yet he pressed on, driven by the memory of the voice and the vision of the ship. When he finally reached the coast, possibly near modern-day Wexford, he saw it. A ship being loaded with cargo, ready to set sail. The vision was real. Exhausted and penniless, he approached the ship's captain and asked for passage. The captain, seeing a poor, ragged runaway, flatly refused him. It seemed his journey had been for nothing. Disheartened but not defeated, Patrick did the only thing he knew how to do. He turned away and began to pray. He prayed that the captain's heart would be softened, that God would not abandon him now at the very edge of freedom. Before he had even finished his prayer, one of the sailors called out to him. The captain had changed his mind. They would take him aboard. It was a miracle, a direct and immediate answer to his desperate plea. As he stepped onto that ship, leaving the land of his enslavement behind, Patrick knew with absolute certainty that the God he had found in the lonely hills was a God who heard his prayers and guided his steps. Returning home should have been the end of the story. After that perilous sea journey and his miraculous escape, Patrick was finally reunited with his family in Britain. They were, just overjoyed to see the son they thought they had lost forever. They embraced him, wept with him, and begged him never to leave them again. They wanted him to put the trauma of Ireland behind him, to settle back into the comfortable life that had been stolen from him years before. And for a time, he did just that. He enjoyed the warmth of family, the security of home, and the relief of freedom. But the man who returned was not the boy who had been taken. Ireland had left an indelible mark on his soul. The peace he sought was honestly elusive. His nights were troubled by visions. In one recurring and powerful dream, he saw a man named Victor, who seemed to have come from Ireland. this man was carrying a great number of letters. He handed one to Patrick, and as Patrick began to read it, he saw the title, The Voice of the Irish. At that very moment, he heard it, not with his ears, but with his heart. He heard the collective voices of the people from the wood of Folklute, the very area near the Western Sea where he had been enslaved. They were crying out to him, pleading with one voice, "Oh, holy boy, we ask you to come and walk among us once more." The call was so real, so profound, that it broke his heart. He felt their plea as a physical ache. These were the voices of the people who had enslaved him, the people living in what he called the darkness of the land. Yet he felt not anger or resentment, but an overwhelming sense of compassion. The God who had saved him from Ireland was now calling him back to it. He was being asked to return not as a slave, but as a servant. He was to bring the light of the faith that had saved his soul to the very people who had taken his freedom. It was a calling that honestly defied all logic and reason. His family could not understand it. Why would he ever want to return to the place of his suffering? Why would he risk his life to help his former captors? They pleaded with him to stay, to choose a safe and normal life. But the call was undeniable. It was a divine command that resonated in the deepest part of his being. He knew what he had to do. His escape from Ireland was not just for his own freedom. It was part of a much larger plan. He had been brought out of darkness so that he could one day return and light a candle for an entire nation. The journey home was over, but his true mission was just beginning. You know, a calling from God is one thing, but honestly, being prepared to answer it is something else entirely. Patrick understood that his profound personal faith just wasn't enough if he was going to return to Ireland as a missionary and face the deeply entrenched pagan culture of the Druids. He would need knowledge, authority, and wisdom. He couldn't simply go back as the runaway slave who had learned to pray. He needed to become a priest, a bishop, a true emissary of the church. And, well, this meant his journey back to Ireland would be delayed by many long years of intense study and spiritual formation, and his passion had to be tempered with education and discipline. The exact details of these so-called lost years aren't fully known, but it's widely believed that Patrick traveled to the continent, to Gaul, what we now call France, to pursue his religious education. He likely studied in the great monastic centers of the time, like Lerins and Auxerre. There, he would have immersed himself in the scriptures, theology, and the traditions of the church. The man who had once been an uneducated slave was now learning from the greatest minds of his generation. For maybe 20 years or more, Patrick devoted himself to this preparation. It really was a testament to his patience and his unwavering commitment to the call he had received. But this period of training wasn't just academic. It was a time of deep spiritual growth and maturation. He was being molded from a man of simple, raw faith into a leader. Patrick learned the structure of the church, the art of rhetoric, and the strategies for spreading the gospel in a hostile world. He was ordained as a priest and eventually consecrated as a bishop. The shepherd boy from the hills of Ireland had become a prince of the church, vested with the authority to baptize, to establish churches, and to ordain new priests. His personal experience of God's grace was now combined with the institutional power and ancient wisdom of Christianity. Finally, the time was right. Decades after his vision of the voice of the Irish, the man who had left Britain as Maewyn was ready to return to Ireland as Bishop Patrick. He was no longer the frightened teenager who had been dragged ashore in chains. He was a man in his 40s or 50s, filled with purpose and armed with faith, knowledge, and authority. Patrick was returning to face the people who had enslaved him, not with a sword, but with a message of forgiveness and salvation. His long and patient preparation was complete. The servant of God was ready to begin his life's great work. When Patrick finally set foot on Irish soil once more, he was entering a world steeped in ancient traditions and primal beliefs. This was not the Romanized, Christianized Britain he had left behind. Ireland in the 5th century was a mosaic of rival kingdoms and tribes, a land where spiritual authority rested not with priests, but with Druids. The Druids were more than just priests. They were the judges, scientists, lore keepers, and political advisors of their people. They held immense power, their influence woven into every aspect of Irish life. They were the guardians of a pagan faith that honored nature gods, ancestral spirits, and the cyclical power of the seasons. Patrick arrived not as a conqueror, but as a humble servant, yet his presence was an immediate and direct challenge to the established order. The Druids saw him as a profound threat. His message of a single, all-powerful God who existed outside of nature directly contradicted their worldview. His claim of a spiritual authority that came from Rome, a place far beyond their shores, sought to undermine their own sacred power, which was rooted in the Irish soil itself. They saw him as a competitor, a purveyor of a foreign magic who sought to lure the people away from their ancestral ways. From the very beginning, his mission was a spiritual battle. Patrick didn't begin by preaching in the fields. He understood the structure of Irish society. Power flowed from the top down. To convert the people, he first had to confront the kings and chieftains. He traveled from one kingdom to another, seeking audiences with the local rulers. These encounters were often dramatic confrontations, pitting Patrick's faith against the magic and influence of the Druids. There are famous legends from this time, like the story of Patrick lighting the Paschal fire on the Hill of Slain in defiance of the High King's decree that no fire should be lit before the king's own pagan festival fire at Tara. This act was a bold declaration. It symbolized that the light of Christ would not be extinguished by any earthly power. Patrick was a master of using powerful symbolic gestures that the Irish people could understand. He knew he was not just introducing new ideas. He was challenging a deeply ingrained spiritual reality. The land was considered enchanted, a place where the veil between the human and spirit worlds was thin. To succeed, Patrick had to demonstrate that the power of his God was greater than the power of the Druids and the old gods they served. His mission was to re-enchant the land with a new and more powerful story. Patrick's mission in Ireland was not just a campaign of words, it was a demonstration of power. In a land where people believed in magic and miracles, simple preaching just wasn't always enough. To win the hearts and minds of the Irish people, he had to show them that his God was not an abstract concept, but a living force more powerful than the Druids' spells. Stories of his miracles spread throughout the land, becoming a key part of his success. These were not small feats. They were seen as undeniable displays of divine power that left the people, and often their leaders, in awe. And reports of healing the sick giving sight to the blind, and even raising the dead were essential to his ministry. One of the most famous legends, of course, is that of Patrick using the three-leaved shamrock to explain the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity. While this story may have emerged later, it really captures the essence of his method. He didn't seek to completely erase the old culture. Instead, he skillfully adapted it, using familiar symbols and concepts to explain the new faith. Patrick took pagan sacred wells and blessed them. He placed Christian crosses on ancient pagan standing stones. He built his churches on sites that were already considered sacred. And this approach made Christianity feel less like a foreign imposition and more like a fulfillment of the deepest spiritual longings the people already had. The results of his mission were astonishing. Entire tribes, led by their chieftains, converted to the new faith. It is said that over the course of his lifetime, Patrick baptized tens of thousands of people and consecrated hundreds of bishops and thousands of priests to carry on the work. He established monasteries and churches across the island, creating a new spiritual infrastructure that would change Ireland forever. He brought literacy and learning, as his new clergy needed to read the Latin scriptures. The man who had come to serve his former captors was now their spiritual father, guiding an entire nation into a new era. His success was not without danger. He faced numerous threats on his life. He was arrested, robbed, and beaten. The Druids and chieftains who resisted his message did not give up their power easily, but Patrick's courage just never wavered. He was driven by a tireless love for the Irish people and an unshakable conviction in his divine mission. He traveled to the most remote and dangerous parts of the island, determined to bring the message of hope to everyone, from the highest king to the humblest peasant. The fire of faith he had lit on the Hill of Slane was now spreading like a wildfire across the whole of Ireland. The legacy of St. Patrick extends far beyond the shores of Ireland. His work did more than just convert a nation. It transformed Ireland into a sanctuary of faith and learning at a really critical moment in history. As Patrick was completing his life's work, in the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. The great cities of the continent fell into ruin, libraries were burned, and Europe entered a period we often call the Dark Ages. A shadow was falling over the mainland, but in Ireland, a light had just been lit. The island that had once been on the pagan fringe of the world was about to become a beacon for all of Christendom. The monasteries that Patrick and his successors founded became vibrant centers of learning. While chaos reigned in Europe, Irish monks were diligently preserving the knowledge of the ancient world. They copied not only the Bible, but also the great works of Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and science. These scriptoriums were islands of light in a sea of encroaching darkness. The monks developed a unique and beautiful artistic style seen in masterpieces like the Book of Kells, blending intricate Celtic designs with Christian themes. Ireland became known as the Isle of Saints and Scholars, a testament to the profound cultural and intellectual flourishing that followed its conversion. This golden age didn't remain confined to Ireland. Fueled by a missionary zeal inherited from Patrick, Irish monks began to swarm like bees across the European continent. They founded monasteries in Scotland, England, France, Germany, Switzerland, and even Italy. These monks, such as Columba and Columbanus, did more than just build churches. They re-established centers of learning, reintroduced classical texts, and helped to re-evangelize the very heart of the former Roman Empire. The faith that Patrick had brought to Ireland was now being carried back to Europe by his spiritual children, helping to lay the foundations for medieval civilization. The journey of St. Patrick is one of history's most extraordinary tales of transformation, and it's the story of a boy who was indifferent to God, a slave who found faith in his suffering, and a missionary who returned to love and serve his enemies. He found a pagan land shrouded in superstition and left behind a Christian nation that would become an engine for the faith. His impact is immeasurable. He didn't just drive the snakes out of Ireland, as the legend goes. In a much deeper sense, he lit a fire that not only warmed a nation, but also cast a guiding light across a continent, ensuring that the wisdom of the ages and the light of faith would endure through the darkest of times.